wanted to ask you about your lawsuit. When did you file it? Why did you file it? And what's happened since?
Filed it just at the end of December, right after Christmas, with the hopes of getting an injunction, getting a restraining order against the law being implemented, and then a hearing to throw it out. We got a piece of the law thrown out, restrained, and then on March 2nd we have a hearing to throw out, to contest the whole law. The reasoning is pretty simple. This law was put into effect against the will of the voters who a dozen years ago asked for donation caps. We've had donation caps, and everybody's had to play on that playing field for about a dozen years. This last session, the legislature threw out donation caps. They also gagged political contenders in the process during the months of January through May. The public relations spin on that was this is going to allow lawmakers focus on lawmaking instead of campaigning. The effect of it is lawmakers are rubbing shoulders with donors, special interests, lobbyists every day for those 4.5 months, whereas contenders would be restrained from speech, electronic speech, communicating with their supporters, responding to policy issues, and talking to those self-same special interests during those 4.5 months. Patently unfair. By the way, federal court has already thrown this out once. So when they wrote this legislation, they were not respecting the law of the land as it already existed, both in terms of gag orders and restraint of free speech. So it was a no-brainer.
So what part was thrown out for a minute?
The part that was thrown out, unfortunately, the only part that was thrown out was the easiest thing to throw out prior to contesting this in a hearing in March. What was thrown out were campaign limits. That sort of leaves a void between now and March. What are the limits? Are there any? What are the rules of play? Hopefully this will incentivize both the restraining order and the fact that there's going to be a hearing coming up on this, and it may be thrown out. This will incentivize the Assembly to get down to the business of producing good legislation. That starts with this. The old law on election campaign financing provided caps, but it had some bugs in it. Take the bugs out, but don't use a Sherman tank to do it. The problem with Sherman tank legislation is that it wipes out a lot of the other stuff in the landscape as well. An example, obviously, is they wiped out donation caps in their rush to remove a bug, legislative committees and their giving.
So what the judge did last week was temporarily re-implement the caps on donations?
I thought that would be the outcome if he did a restraining order, but he picked, I think it was the section 132-030, and that was just the part that established would address donation caps. So whether we abide by the old law or not may be elective. It may be legislators deciding on their own what do they do between now and March 2. Luckily, we're 2 years away from an election, so my guess is there's not going to be a lot of activity. There may be some money moved around, but there's not going to be a lot of active, programmatic campaign fundraising done between now and March.
Okay. See, that's a little different than I thought. I thought that the part that he threw out was the part dealing with the time limits on when you could raise funds. So that part is still in place?
He threw out, you're right, he threw out the part that gagged campaigning. Well, he removed it for everybody. So anybody can campaign right now, and that means they can campaign with no limits.
Okay. So they can't campaign with no limits right now.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right.
So the bill really did two major changes to the campaign election law, and one is taking away the campaign limit for how much you can raise, and the other one is implementing a limit on when you can raise.
Right.
Which one of those two were you most concerned with?
Donor caps. Donor caps. Missouri was actually making progress, as were many other states, in putting caps on the amount of money people could raise to run for office. Obviously, running for office is expensive because communications is electronic today. Communications uses stamps. You have to reach a lot of people. It takes money. However, if you put a cap on donor limits, everybody's got pretty much the same opportunities to raise money and spend it on expenses. There were some bugs in the system, but those are bugs that can be, in fact, I know that there's going to be a bill submitted this year that'll address there was one of the particular bugs that I noticed was that legislative committees could donate 10 times the $325 individual limit. Well, that might mean there were a lot of legislative committees formed. The legislation that'll be probably put out this year, this session, will say in aggregate, all combined legislative committees can do 10 times. So one group of committees can actually do that, such as the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
Last part here. You recently ran for office.
In Webster Groves, Shrewsbury, Glendale, and Oakland.
What district was that?
91st.
94. How do you think your campaign would have been affected if this law was in place then?
I would have still lost. That's about it. The Republicans are very effective at raising 4 or 5 times as much money as the Democrats. So certainly they will, if there aren't limits, they can raise a lot of money. They can do a lot of communicating, and obviously, if you're getting your name and face and a very clean message in front of voters, whether it represents what you're doing in office or not, if you're doing that a lot, it's going to diminish the import of other candidates. It's going to raise your level in the field.
Anything else you want to say?
No, I'm just glad.
What are you hoping to? Are you hoping? Is it March 2nd? Or is that the
March 2nd is the.
When the judge comes back on March 2nd, do you hope for this whole thing to be thrown out, or would you consider just part of it being thrown out a victory?
No, part of it wouldn't be a victory. All of it would be a victory. Yeah, I think it's going to take that incentive, getting that off the table, for the legislators to get down to the business of writing good law, of debugging the existing law to make it work for voters, not just for special interests. You know, I want to say this is important. The new law allowed a very small class of wealthy influentials to decide who gets elected, because then $100,000, $400,000 checks can be written by those influentials to get their advocate elected. And really, having donation limits prevented that. That's the big difference.